A strange meeting. At 5:30, Holmes returned. He was very pleased about something. "I have had great success, Watson," he said, as I gave him a cup of tea. "What, Holmes? Have you solved the mystery already?" I asked in surprise. No. But I have discovered something very interesting. Miss Morstan said that her father had a very good friend in India. His name was Major Sholto. "Yes," I said. Major Sholto had retired from the army. He was living in London when Captain Morstan disappeared. But he did not know that Morstan was in England. "Well," said Holmes, "I have just been to the offices of the Times newspaper. I looked through the old copies of the newspaper, and I discovered that Major Sholto died on 28th of April 1882. Perhaps I am very stupid, Holmes, but I don't see why this discovery is interesting." "Listen," Holmes said. "Captain Morstan disappeared. He had one friend in London, Major Sholto. But Major Sholto said that he didn't know that Captain Morstan was in London. 4 years later, on 28th of April 1882, Sholto died. A few days later, on the 4th of May 1882, Captain Morstan's daughter saw the advertisement in a newspaper. Then, she received a valuable present. These presents came every year. Why do the presents arrive on that day? They must have something to do with Sholto's death. I was still puzzled. "But Sholto died 6 years ago," I said. "Why did Miss Morstan receive that letter today, 6 years later?" "The letter speaks of telling her the truth." "What can it mean?" "I hope that we'll find the answers to these questions tonight, Watson," said Holmes seriously. "Are you ready?" It's 6 o'clock and here is Miss Morstan. Miss Morstan entered the room. She was wearing a dark cloak and hat. She did not seem afraid, but her beautiful face was very pale. I picked up my hat and my heaviest stick. I noticed that Holmes took his gun from his drawer and put it into his pocket. We got into a cab and were soon on our way to the Lyceum Theatre. In the cab, Miss Morstan took a piece of paper out of her bag. "Mr. Holmes, I forgot to show you this. This note was found in my father's luggage. It is very strange. I don't know what it means. Perhaps it isn't very important. But I wanted you to see it." Holmes unfolded the note carefully and spread it on his knee. He took a magnifying glass out of his pocket and examined the paper. "This paper was made in India," he remarked. "Have a look at it, Watson." I took the note and studied it carefully. The paper was thin and old. There was a drawing on the paper. "It looks like the plan of a large building," I said. "Somebody has made a mark to show a certain place in the building. But what are these names at the bottom? And what is the meaning of the sign of 4? I don't understand what this note means," said Holmes. "But it might be important." I will keep it. He sat back in the cab. Miss Morstan and I talked quietly together. But Holmes did not say anything. I knew he was thinking hard. It was getting dark, and the people in the streets were hurrying home from work. I was feeling a little afraid. I wondered what kind of person we would meet at the Lyceum Theater. There were many people outside the theater. Everyone was meeting friends and going in to see the play. The letter had told us to stand outside on the left. We waited. Suddenly a small dark man appeared. "Are you Miss Morstan and her friends?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "You must promise me that these men are not policemen," said the stranger. "They are not policemen," replied Miss Morstan. "Then come with me," said the man. He led us quickly across the street to another cab and opened the door. We went inside. The man closed the door and jumped up onto the driver's seat of the cab. The horse moved off quickly. We passed through so many streets that I was very soon lost. I had no idea where we were going. I was feeling nervous, and Miss Morstan's face looked white. Sherlock Holmes was calm. Our strange driver did not turn round or speak to us. The only sound was the noise of the horse's hooves. At last we stopped. We were outside a house in a dark, quiet street. It had only one small light in the kitchen window. There were no lights in any of the other houses in the street. We knocked at the door. It was opened immediately by an Indian servant. The Indian was wearing a bright yellow turban on his head. He had white clothes and a yellow belt. It was very strange to see such brightly colored clothes in this quiet street in London. "My master is waiting for you," said the servant. As he spoke, we heard a man's voice. It came from one of the rooms inside the house. "Bring them in to me," the voice called. "Bring them straight in to me." The death of Major Sholto. We followed the Indian servant into the house. He stopped in front of an open door. "Come in, said the voice. We entered, Holmes, Miss Morstan and myself, and were astonished. The room in which we were standing was full of Indian paintings and ornaments. The carpet was soft and very thick. There were 2 large tiger skins on the walls. In the center of the room stood a strange little man with a bald head. He was smiling, but he seemed very nervous. "My name," said the bald-headed man, "is Thaddeus Sholto. You are Miss Morstan, of course. And these 2 gentlemen. This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson." "A doctor!" cried Thaddeus Sholto excitedly. "Oh, please could you listen to my heart? I am very worried about my heart." I listened to his heart beating. But I could hear nothing wrong with it. "There is nothing wrong with your heart," I told him. "I'm so glad," said Thaddeus Sholto. Miss Morstan, your father had a very weak heart. If his heart had been stronger, he would have been alive today. Miss Morstan sat down, and her face turned very white. I knew that he was dead, she said. There were tears in her eyes. I was very angry with Thaddeus Sholto. He did not notice how much he had upset Miss Morstan. Please tell us why we have been brought here, said Miss Morstan. So Thaddeus Sholto began his strange story, and we listened. My father, Sholto said, was Major Sholto of the Indian Army. He retired from the army about 11 years ago. He bought a house in North London. He called the house Pondicherry Lodge. My brother, Bartholomew, and I were his only children. We knew that Captain Morstan, Miss Morstan's father, and our father had been very good friends in India. When we heard that Captain Morstan had disappeared, we were very upset. My brother, Bartholomew, and I also knew that our father was afraid of something. He never went out alone. He often spoke about a man with a wooden leg who followed him. He seemed very afraid of this man. Did he tell you why he was afraid? Asked Holmes. No, he didn't, Thaddeus Sholto replied. Then he continued with his story. One day in 1882, our father received a letter from India. This letter upset him very much. He became ill. Every day he grew weaker. At last, he was dying. He asked to see me and my brother, Bartholomew. We went to his room. He told us to lock the door and come over to the bed. Then he held our hands and spoke to us. He said that he wanted to tell us the truth about Captain Morstan's death. He was the only person who knew this terrible secret. When Father was in India with Captain Morstan, they found a great treasure. It was called the Great Agra Treasure. The jewels in this treasure were worth more than £1 million. Father brought the Agra treasure back to England. Morstan followed him and came at once to the house to ask for his share. But the treasure had made Father greedy. He did not want to give any of it to Morstan. He wanted to keep it all for himself. Morstan became very angry. They had a terrible argument. Father knew that Morstan's heart was weak. Suddenly, the color of Morstan's face changed. Father saw at once that Morstan was dead. He did not know what to do. He had not killed Morstan. But he was afraid that people would believe that he had killed Morstan. He decided to say nothing. He hid the body, and he also hid the Great Agra treasure. Soon the news of Morstan's disappearance spread through London. Only our father knew the terrible truth. He told us as he was dying that he had been a wicked and greedy man. He said that he had acted very wrongly, but that he had paid for his crime. The Agra treasure never brought him happiness, only fear and guilt. Then he told us that Captain Morstan had a daughter called Mary. He asked us to listen carefully. Then he began to tell us, where he had hidden the treasure. At that moment, a terrible change came over our father's face. He pointed at the window and cried out in a voice full of fear, "Keep him out! Keep him out!" My brother and I stared at the window. We saw a horrible face looking in through the window. It was wild and had a black beard and cruel eyes. We rushed to the window, but the man had gone. When we went back to the bed, Father was dead. "What did you do then?" asked Holmes. "We ran out into the garden," replied Sholto. "We looked everywhere, but we found nothing. In the morning, we went to our father's room. We found that someone had been in the room during the night. There was a piece of paper on the bed beside my father's body. And on this paper some words were written. These words were the sign of 4.